So in this second part of the workshop, we wanted to look briefly at different dissemination channels and platforms that we commonly use. I've drawn together a few examples of work we've done here in Australia to target sometimes extremely broad audiences, other times very specific groups like clinicians or policymakers to do with a particular review. I thought that might be a good way to understand how these channels work in practice. So I'll share my whole screen because some of the images and text probably look better that way, and go from there. Okay, so I'll just start by doing a quick run through of the main dissemination channels we use here at Cochrane Australia. And I know many other people across Cochrane are keen on using these channels too. The first is Cochrane websites, newsletters, and social media feeds, which I always find a really good starting point for any dissemination of review findings. Next up, print and broadcast media. I know some of you may be daunted by the idea of reaching audiences this way, but I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. I'm a really big fan of using the media to reach different audiences and broad audiences, so we'll talk about that. Social media, which is a fantastic way to reach really targeted, specific audiences and interest groups. I'm not talking about that much today, as Stephanie, I know, has organised another workshop that focuses solely on social media, so I'll try to steer clear of that. But also YouTube and podcasting, which is increasingly popular. And I can talk a bit about that in the Q&A, as I produced 3 series of the Recommended Dose podcast for Cochrane Australia, which was a really interesting experiment in reaching very broad audiences with sometimes very complex information. So that was often challenging, and I can talk about that if anyone's interested in that aspect of things. All right, this first example is a review on vitamin D for asthma. So the starting point for me thinking about disseminating these findings was, who are the findings of interest to, and who are they relevant to, and why do people really need to know about it? So some quick research revealed 1 in 10 or 3 million Australians suffer from asthma. And I know it's a big issue for children and their parents in particular. So for any review I work on dissemination-wise, I think about this kind of broader context. What's the conditional issue? How prevalent is it? What do people need to know about it? You're much more likely to get attention and engagement if you put the findings in a relevant local context, I find, in many cases. In this case, with parents and children in mind, I got in contact with Asthma Australia, who are the biggest not-for-profit peak organisation that works with GPs and schools to provide evidence-based information, workshops and advice. So they have over 2 million visitors to their website each month and publish a print magazine that's read by clinicians and policymakers and researchers as well. So after a few quick chats and emails to them, I just found a contact person on their website, gave them a call, sent them some emails, worked with the review authors to develop a content package, which Asthma Australia were really happy to publish online and in print. So this set up a great working relationship with them, and they went on to do the same for the next review on yoga for asthma. So you can see a couple of examples from them, the first 2 images and the Asthma Australia little square there with the balloon. That's their magazine and web content that they put up for us. So this is a great example of partnering with another organisation who already has the networks or connections to audiences that you are keen to target. To reach the broader public for this one, I worked with the authors to pitch the review findings to the Herald Sun, which is a tabloid newspaper here with a huge readership of around 1 million people a day. The Conversation, which is an online news platform, much more highbrow, loved by researchers and policymakers and academics. And finally, the Health Report, which is one of Australia's most popular radio programs and podcasts. So each of these different outlets appeals to and reaches different audiences within the umbrella of the public. So this is another quick example of targeting consumers and the public. Given I promise not to talk too much about social media, I won't say too much about it, but this review was on antidepressants. It came out just a couple of weeks ago, and I had the good fortune to work with Jess on this one. We created an infographic for this one for social media and a very targeted list of people and organisations to share it with. I also sent the infographic and an article to a popular public health blog site called Cochrane. And again, I won't go too much into this side of things because it is social media, but suffice to say, it's a really huge part of reaching this sort of finely targeted interest and professional group audience. In this case, it was mental health, and Jess can talk about that more in the Q&A, no doubt, as she and the Mental Elf on Twitter make a great team. So back to vitamin D again here. We know practitioners are a key audience for clinical findings for many reviews. Here are some quick examples of targeting nurses and GPs through journals and professional society websites. And of course, the Cochrane blog shots are often used to provide a snapshot of the evidence, again, on social media. Policymakers can be a bit more of a tricky or elusive audience to reach, I've found, but I keep a close watch on what's going on in our state and national level governments here at any given time. My background is in public policy and government, so I know there are always many reviews and inquiries and reports being written at any given time in the health sphere. So in this example, a new Cochrane review on elder abuse coincided with a national inquiry into elder abuse. I put a brief one-page summary of the review findings together along with the review and submitted that to the inquiry. We then wrote a newsletter article about it and tweeted that out too. And this meant we were both making a practical contribution to policy debate within government and engaging in a broader public discussion that was going on about elder abuse in the media at that time. Okay, I'm conscious of time here, so I'll just quickly run through researchers and research funders, a few examples here. I like to profile researchers on our website, Cochrane reviewers. I know that researchers like reading about each other and their work. In terms of funders, the example I have here is Julian Elliott's podcast that we did for the recommended dose. So he went on one episode and shortly after that was contacted by a top health official who had heard the episode and wanted his thoughts and input into a policy on health systems. So he was called into the department and shared his views there. So that was a great example of how the podcast was meeting research funder target audience. The last two are just a couple of visual abstracts that we developed in the last year or so to share with research funders and research organizations, a snapshot of findings from Cochrane Review. So I'm always really keen to find short, snappy, visually appealing ways to summarize the evidence and get them to all audience groups, because I think people are really receptive to something quick and snappy and good looking, because there's such a demand for, people's attention. It's hard to get it. This is a good way to do so. Okay, so that's a lot of examples, platforms you can use, but what's the secret to engaging audiences on those platforms and getting your work to people through some of these media channels I've highlighted? I asked Australia's resident award-winning national science reporter to share his tips with us, not just to give you a break from me presenting at this stage, but because he literally writes about science and health for hundreds of thousands of people each day, hugely different audiences reading his work. So here are his top 5 tips for Cochrane contributors.